And welcome to the second Rhodes Talk of the semester. I'm delighted to have brought to Brown today an old friend, Peter Goodman. Peter and I got to know each other when Europe was breaking itself after the financial crisis. You were the London correspondent of the New York Times at that point, weren't you? That's how we met.
No, we met earlier.
Was it earlier than that? What was it?
The Washington Post and doing international econ.
Oh, that's
You
right.
brought me to a thing with Carol Duffy here.
I did.
A retrospective on who was to blame for
Mm.
the financial crisis.
That's right, that's what it was.
Compressing it too
And
much.
then you went to London.
Then I went to London.
Then they broke Europe.
That's right.
Right, which has never recovered. So that's fine. So anyway, another sort of point of symmetry was in 2020, we both had books coming out. I had Angrynomics, and he had this brilliant book, which if you haven't heard of it or read it, go read it, because it really is fantastic, called Davos Man, which is essentially just the takedown of this kind of self-appointed global elite. It's just totally brilliant. Of course, that was wiped out by the pandemic. His revenge was to then write a book about the pandemic, which is this one, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. We just did a podcast on this, so I'll put my little slant on this. I don't think the title's right. There's a weird way in which British people and Americans disagree on the word how. So when Americans say how, you actually mean why. But when we say why, we mean something very specific, which is not how. How is a mechanism. It's going to describe how this thing fell apart. Why tells you why it fell apart. And what he really gets into in the book is why this fell apart. And it really has nothing to do with the pandemic. It has to do with the state of American markets and market structures and American corporations and the incentives that they face. And it's a very, very different story of the pandemic from the one you've heard before, which is why I'm delighted that he can tell us about it here.
Why you related and how you
Well, thank you, Mark. That's it. I'm changing the title of the book for the paperback. I'm convinced. There's no question that it's about market structure. I like to name names and hold those accountable who need to be held accountable. So why it is. Anyway, thanks for bringing me here. It's great to be here. A couple months ago, I found myself in the cab of a large tractor trailer that was driving through northern India, from just outside of Delhi to Jaipur over the course of the day. And you may wonder why I was in this cab of this truck. I certainly wondered that. It was 105 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 41 degrees for you Celsius fans. There was no air conditioning in the cab, and every breeze was like a gift from the gods. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that every time we hit any kind of pothole or bump, I was slumped under the bunk at the back of the truck, and my head would hit this big pipe above me. So I definitely wondered why I was there, but I was there for a good reason. I was trying to figure out whether India can become an alternative to China for factory production as the sense of decoupling or de-risking or deglobalization or whatever term you favor takes hold, and companies respond to the shocks of the pandemic as well as the trade war, first launched by the Trump administration, continued under the Biden administration, and no doubt continued regardless of who wins the presidential election in a few weeks' time, takes hold and encourages multinational companies to look for ways to diminish their reliance on China. And I was trying to figure out really what happens to the global supply chain in the midst of a time of enormous disruption. And that's one of the questions that we're asking with increasing frequency. What we're really asking is globalization over? And the spoiler, it's not, but it's changing, which we'll get to at the end of this. But I want to discuss the origins of these disruptions and the implications for globalization. And I should tell you, I never thought that I would write a book about the global supply chain. It seemed like a pretty wonky subject. It was a subject that was always kind of at the periphery of a lot of the things I've been writing about over the course of 25 or so years, writing about international economics. But the subject was sort of thrust on me, as I think it has been for all of us, when this supply chain failed in the midst of the toughest time of our lives. And, to run out of ventilators and the piece parts for ventilators, for medicines, for personal protective gear in the middle of the worst public health catastrophe in 100 years makes you contemplate what's really going on. In the same way, I like the metaphor of the electrical grid. We don't give a thought to the electrical grid when we flip the light switch on. We just expect the lights to come on, and it usually does. But if it doesn't, and we're in the dark at a time when that really matters, well, then we start to reflect on what's going on back there. And that's how it's been, I think, for all of us. And I should say, it hit me in a very personal way because I was living in London. My wife and I had a baby born in April of 2020, and my wife was quite stoic about the fact that her parents couldn't fly over from New York to help us with the baby. I could only be in the hospital for an hour. After we got home, we couldn't go to the pediatrician, and this was all, understood. But where my wife really lost it, and she's a calm person by nature, was when she said, well, why don't we try to get some hand sanitizer? And we couldn't find it anywhere. It was nowhere available in our North London neighborhood. Couldn't go online and find it. And even when we started to look for the ingredients to make our own hand sanitizer and discovered that those couldn't be found either, she looked at me and said, you're supposed to know about stuff like this. What the hell's going on? And I realized that I didn't have a satisfying explanation. And I came to do a bunch of stories digging in to what it was that was going on. And I came to see that we were suffering a breakdown in the sort of globalization that has dominated most of our lives, this mode in which we've been encouraged to believe that place really doesn't matter. A factory down the street is the same as a factory across the ocean, so long as there's container shipping and the internet and this machinery that has invited us not to think about the working people whose labors go into making and producing the goods that arrive to our door, and to pretend that it's all just seamless. We were steeped in the idea, sorry to often picked on Francis Fukuyama, that history was over, and we had this template for liberal democracy and liberalized trade. Never mind that was a fairy tale, really from inception. If you go back in history, you see that tariffs had a lot to do with the rise of Britain and, of course, colonialism in our own country as well. But we had been invited to participate in this delusion that liberalized trade, liberal democracy, container shipping, and the internet had just erased risk, and we could just pretend that everything's perfectly connected. I also came to see that this breakdown that we were suffering was a breakdown in the labor exploitation that is part and parcel of our supply chain, our transportation systems, our manufacturing. We are dependent upon a normal in which many of the people doing the work that's vital to making our stuff and getting it to our door can't support their own families at anything close to a middle-class standard. They're increasingly accepting the risks that used to be corporate risks for their time, effectively on hold, constantly, though only paid for the hours that they're actually in factories or behind the wheels of trucks or working on rail maintenance crews for railroads. It was also a breakdown in our excessive reliance on just-in-time. I think most of us are probably familiar with this concept of just-in-time, pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War as a reaction to Ford-style mass assembly, where you just made as much stuff as you possibly could at massive scale and worried about selling all that product later. And Toyota came up with the sensible idea to think about inventory the way a supermarket thinks about milk. You want enough of it that everyone can buy milk when they need it, but not so much of it that you end up spilling milk that's been sitting around, goes bad. They had their suppliers deliver stuff they needed on the assembly line in real time. And then along comes McKinsey, whose story I tell in the book, and other business consultancies working in the interest of shareholder maximization, where share prices going up become everything, and they convince corporate executives to slash inventory, stop putting parts in warehouses as a hedge against inevitable trouble. Just take the savings, give it to yourself, corporate executive, as a reward for hiring McKinsey, give it to shareholders in the form of dividends, and your share prices will go up. And that sets us up for a series of shocks that those who've been paying attention to supply chains were aware of, long before the pandemic, where we just don't have a hedge against trouble. The first supply chain disruption story I ever wrote actually was back in 1999. There was an earthquake in Taiwan, and Taiwan was already a big center of chip making. We had shortages of chips for months after, and early on, some people said, maybe we've overdone it with just in time, and maybe we should spread production out a little bit. We heard similar stuff said in 2011, 2012, in the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, which also led to shortages. But we kept on going with the sort of globalization that we've been steeped in that has logically sent production to China because China offers this unbeatable combination of efficiency at scale, low wages, low costs of production, very comprehensive investment in infrastructure and ports and roads and in the electrical grid. And we kept doubling down on that mode because if you were running a publicly traded corporation and everybody else was doing likewise in your industry, you either followed that script and you got those low savings, or you deviated and then you were at risk of being thrown out of your job because you weren't actually getting the cheapest cost of the production. So one of the things that also broke down and that the pandemic revealed, and that I'll only talk about briefly here, but that's in detail in my book, is the reality that many of our industries are dominated by companies that have massive market concentrations and that are effectively monopolies. And we've pretended, back to this sort of delusion that we don't have risk, that supply and demand is working perfectly, and if we have a shortage of something, well, then some new market entrant will show up to produce more of that stuff. In many key industries, that just simply isn't true, and the one that I look at in most detail in the book is shipping. So the international shipping cartel is comprised of three alliances, think like airline alliances, that control something like 90% of the traffic on the key routes. That's China to the west coast of the United States and Asia to Europe. And I follow one container in the book, the key shipment for a startup company that makes these Sesame Street themed bath toys in a little town in Mississippi. I followed their most important shipment ever, the first order they ever made for Sesame Street, trying to get this stuff to their warehouse in Mississippi in time for the holiday season of 2021. And the guy running the company, this interesting guy named Hagen Walker, is accustomed to paying roughly $2,000 to move a container of goods from China to the west coast of the US and then truck or rail to Mississippi. And suddenly he's being demanded prices $20,000. $22,000, $25,000. And even when he makes his bookings, he's told, oh, actually, there's no room on the ship unless you pay, even more through some special handling charges. He eventually pays $28,000, loses a bunch of bookings, eventually gets the ship across the water to Long Beach, where it sits in a queue for a couple of weeks with 55 other ships just floating around, effectively turned into floating warehouses, because there's so much traffic coming from China to the west coast of the US that the whole transportation system just buckles. We don't have enough people working in warehouses. We don't have space in warehouses. We don't have enough truck drivers to move containers away from the ports. We've downgraded trucking to such an extent that we've run out of truck drivers, which is really just a way of saying that we've made that job a living hell. And Hagen Walker is representative of importers who are getting really jerked around by this international shipping cartel, but the exporters have it even worse. I spent time with almond farmers in Central California who in the spring of 2022 are looking at a new crop that's about to come in, and they're normally, really happy, right? This is like money growing on trees, but they're actually really nervous because they're sitting on the previous year's crop, and that crop is sold, but they can't get the container shipping companies to give them containers, and the carriers are actually bypassing the port of Oakland, where they usually pick this stuff up. They literally cannot get the ship to stop. Typically, container comes in from Asia to a place like LA or Long Beach, it's unloaded, and then some empty containers are sent up by truck or rail to the Central Valley, loaded up with stuff like almonds. Almonds, by the way, hugely important crop. California, you think Silicon Valley, you think Hollywood, it's still an agricultural state, and almonds are the most important crop of all. 80% of all almonds in the world are grown in California. Well, it turns out the shipping companies are making so much money moving factory goods from China to the West Coast of the US that they would rather take the empty ones and put them right back on the ships and send them back across the Pacific. I mean, we're burning diesel to move air across the Pacific so that they can get the next wave of the gold rush and get the next load of goods from China and bring it back to the West Coast. So the almond farmers, even with contracts to move their cargo, are just stuck. Now, since all of this history that I'm relating, there's a sense of normalcy that's returned, and still the shocks, though, are not going away. We've got, as we speak, actually, we're on the verge of a dock worker strike that will shut down 36 ports on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast of the U.S., could bring shipping prices back up. Shipping prices have been high in recent months because Houthi rebels in Yemen, operating in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, have been opening fire on ships that are headed toward the Suez Canal. As a result, container ships are going, instead of going from Europe to Asia and back and forth through the Suez Canal, it's a shortcut like the Panama Canal. They go the long way around Africa. Costs more. Analysts tell me it probably costs, 35%, 40% more in extra diesel fuel, extra wages they pay to crew who are on these ships for longer. But shipping prices are up like 400% because the international shipping cartel has learned something from the pandemic. And what they've learned is that anxiety is a tool for them. If there are shippers like my guy whose story I tell, moving the Sesame Street dolls, who are worried about getting their stuff on the ship, and they're worried there won't be space, well, they'll pay anything. And so every time now there's a shock to the system, shipping prices go up and shipping companies celebrate record profits. So these shocks are not going away. And as a consequence, you do see some companies looking to move production from places like China to places that are closer to their markets. So that's Turkey in some instances, Eastern Europe for companies that are selling into the largest markets in Western Europe. That's Mexico, Central America, in the US. India, back to where I started this story, is increasingly seen as a way to avoid the Chinese supply chain altogether, at least long term. That said, there are a lot of sort of premature obituaries being written for globalization, but that's not really what's happening. There's a reconfiguration. There's a healthy reemergence of place as a consideration in decision making for businesses. There's certainly this idea that it's no longer a terrific idea to take the computer chip industry and concentrate it on an island that happens to be 90 miles off the coast of mainland China, which not incidentally happens to claim that island as part of its own territory. And so there is a greater demand for resilience in place of this narrow obsession with efficiency. There's more scrutiny of backup plans. I would look at it this way. 15 years ago, if you were a retailer or a manufacturer, you were trying to get your product on the stores of a Walmart superstore. You would fly into Bentonville, Arkansas, which is Walmart's headquarters. You have to fly in and see them. They don't come to you. It's like going to see the Pope. And you got your appointment with the buyer's agent, and they would say, well, where are you making this product? And if the answer was anywhere other than China, you had a problem, because the assumption was that you couldn't possibly be getting the lowest price or manufacturing at the greatest scale. Well, now, if you go do that, if you fly down to Bentonville and you talk to the Walmart people and you pitch them on your product, and they ask you the same question, where are you making this product? And if the question is only in China, you have a problem because they are increasingly concerned about their exposure to the volatility of shipping. They like the idea of land bridges to their major markets, which is one of the reasons why manufacturing production is shifting to places like Mexico, because Mexico, you can use truck or rail. Those are problematic in their own way, but it's a way to limit your dependence upon container shipping to get your stuff to the North American market. And this by the way, is a healthy development, which may seem ironic, considering that those of us who are old enough to remember Ross Perot warning of the giant sucking sound to Mexico, or Trump's, of course, demonization of Mexico and the whole conversation around building a wall. The idea that Mexico could be among the solutions to the American problem of globalization. But the fact is that roughly 30% of the value of the goods that we import from Mexico are made in the United States with American labor. And the counterpart number for China is about 3%. And of course, Chinese state policy is trying very hard to drive that number as close to zero as possible. So when we trade with Mexico, we actually are boosting our own employment. Some production is moving to Vietnam, though what I discovered in researching the book is that the Vietnamese supply chain is really heavily dependent upon the Chinese supply chain. There are lots of electronics, in particular plastics, that are drawn from the Chinese supply chain, which is why I was in the back of that truck in India, because India has its own issues. There's very uneven infrastructure there. Women have been excluded from the workforce, and there are both social and economic reasons why it's difficult to get women into the workforce. Unlike history in China, it's history that people don't like to talk about a lot, but the kind of leveling period of modern Chinese history post 49, when Mao takes over, actually boosted literacy. It did give people a certain commonality of experience. It broke down a lot of gender barriers. And so by the time we get into serious market embracing economic reforms, beginning in the 70s, but really gaining enormous momentum in the 90s, you actually have a Chinese workforce that's very well set up, especially with rural people moving to coastal cities to go and get trained for first very basic factory jobs in industries like apparel and textile making and the like, furniture, up to now much more sophisticated industries. So there are all sorts of reasons to doubt that India can actually replicate the Chinese supply chain, not least that when China was developing into what it is now, there was no other China out there. India has to compete with China. But overall, there is a new value on being closer to markets and in areas where there's greater security. I think, by the way, this gains momentum with this most recent incredible case of the Hezbollah pagers blowing up, which for people in the supply chain has brought to the fore a fear that many people have had for years, that supply chains are so complicated that even the market participants often don't know, which suppliers, which sub-suppliers their own suppliers are doing business with. I mean, I remember doing a story, this is like 20 plus years ago, in China on illegal logging and discovering that IKEA, despite signing up to all sorts of forestry pledges and actually having pretty sophisticated auditing of their own supply chain, was not aware that they were buying wood from a supplier that was buying logs from a sub-supplier that was bringing in illegally harvested logs in the Russian Far East. And this pager example, gives us reason to remember that a car today is made of 30,000 plus parts, many of which cross borders multiple times, getting one treatment in one place, put on a ship, sent somewhere else for another process before it's attached to some other part. Well, every move opens up the risk that, as the pandemic brought home, something could go wrong. Again, being dependent upon exploited labor, on this unregulated international shipping cartel, but also that someone with an agenda of violence could insinuate themselves into the process and effectively weaponize it. So the complexity of the supply chain is its own security issue, and all of this, has brought home that there are sound reasons to try to simplify production and move production closer to markets. That said, and this is my final thought before I'd be delighted to take your questions, I'm not particularly optimistic that this reshoring, nearshoring, deglobalization, de-risking has a sort of natural momentum. It certainly has captured the conversation about security, about manufacturing, about global supply chains. Every company is now talking about just in case instead of just in time. But the financial incentives for, especially for publicly traded companies, are still there, rewarding executives who manage to make the books look better next quarter, and anything that involves, building another factory, redundancy, thinking about resilience that costs money and dilutes earnings, puts an executive potentially in peril. And so long as that short-term financial thinking is in place, we are certainly vulnerable to the supply chain disruptions that will come with whatever the next shock happens to be. And I'll leave you with one story on this front. I looked for the book at why the railroads did such a miserable job of moving freight around during the worst disruptions of the pandemic. And one of the things I discovered was that they were governed by their own version of just-in-time manufacturing or lean manufacturing, known as precision scheduled railroading, which is a fancy term that they used for let's fire lots of people and stick the remaining workers with more jobs and more risk, really. So there are fewer people doing the same amount of work on the road for longer, away from their families, unable to get home for medical appointments, missing the births of children, anniversaries, and the like. And they cut rail service, and trains got longer than ever, so they were more vulnerable to accidents. And why did they do this? Well, they did this because the investor class was delighted to bid up stocks so long as they could point at actual metrics demonstrating improvements in efficiency. Well, we're now being invited to believe that we have this trade-off between resilience versus efficiency, as if efficiency is, who's against efficiency, right? It's cheaper, it's better, it's more convenient. Resilience, yeah, that's good, but it might cost more. Well, this particular kind of efficiency wasn't all that efficient. As I discovered during the research for the book, talked to an engineer with Union Pacific out in Idaho who discovered that he was pulling cargo to the wrong destination because the metric that Union Pacific was touting on Wall Street was so-called dwell time. That's a measure of how long cargo sits in any particular place. And the quicker cargo moves out, the better it is because dwell time is lower. And so this engineer discovers that somebody running the Union Pacific rail yard in Nebraska has internalized this mantra, lower dwell time, lower dwell time. So the next train that's coming in, I don't care where it's going. I'm sticking as many cars onto the back end of that train as possible. So I've done it. I've lowered dwell time. And this engineer discovers, he's pulling loads of auto parts that are supposed to be going to Southern California, and he's taking them north to Oregon. They're going to have to be rerouted back to Nebraska and on to California. He's got barrels of chemicals that paint manufacturers are waiting for. They can't make paint. Somewhere there's some couple that's trying to renovate their kitchen and they can't get their paint because Union Pacific is lower dwell time and the chemicals needed to make the paint are going to the wrong place. So this is my long-winded way of saying we should be very skeptical of these conceptions of efficiency versus resilience, because the efficiency was never truly efficiency in terms of the societal need to begin with. It was always about pointing at some number on a spreadsheet that would make share prices go up. And so long as those shareholder incentives are in place, we should doubt, even though there are some good things going on that we've discussed here already, we should doubt that there will be any fundamental reconfiguration of the supply chain, which has been optimized for monopoly interests, for big box retailers, for companies that have power in places like Washington and state houses, and not optimized for the rest of us, which is to say, those of us who need ventilators in the middle of a pandemic as a business school professor I talked to in London put it to me, if you can't make a ventilator in the middle of a pandemic, you don't get to say, well, at least our share price is high. And that's still where we are today. So thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to take some questions.
For those of you who haven't seen this before, this is called talking without PowerPoint. It actually happens from time to time. It's a rare skill these days.
I hate PowerPoint.
And you're very good at not using it. So
Thank
that's
you.
brilliant. You take your own questions. You
Sure.
can see the floor better than me.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Don't be shy. Go on. I know you want to.
Somebody take
No.
got a question.
Thank you. How can we promote the alignment of financial interests for these companies that are looking to maximize shareholder value, but in doing so might, create some drawbacks in the long term for the rest of society? How do you suggest that we work to align those incentives?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think you have to reform boards for openers, right? I mean, so if boards were doing their jobs, if they were actually scrutinizing operations instead of just working for their buddy, the CEO, who managed to appoint them to the board, there would be a check on the process. I mean, take the rail example, right? The cargo going to the wrong destination. So that's not a trick that would work if boards were doing their jobs, because someone would say, well, hold on. Okay, so that might make dwell time go down. And for a while we can trick, institutional money managers on Wall Street into seeing that as progress. But that's hurting our brand. Moreover, it has to be combined with antitrust enforcement. So, part of why that works is because in territories where Union Pacific is operative, there's one to no alternatives to their services for moving cargo. And, rail, especially in an era when we ought to be thinking seriously about climate change, should be displacing a lot of truck traffic. I mean, it's lower emissions. It's a better way to go. But really, since the beginning of rail, the story, and I tell the whole story of rail, it's a familiar story to some, but maybe not in the context in which I tell it. From the beginning of rail, in America, this is an industry that has tended to produce monopoly and that has been governed by decision-making that's about rewarding investors in the short term rather than operational. Actually, Union Pacific, when they laid the Transcontinental Railroad, the federal government handed out land grants. This is back when we're thinking of the continent as this vast frontier, land grants alongside their route. So Union Pacific actually, instead of thinking about how do we lay the track to get most efficiently from point A to point B, they went on these meandering routes to maximize the free land they could get from the federal government. And these kinds of, this sort of thinking has never really gone away. And so, again, we need antitrust enforcement. We need boards to do their jobs to scrutinize what's really happening for the longer term. Because this is the example I give you is a trading of long-term operational efficiency for short-term gain. And then labor mobilization will take care of some of that as well, so that another group that's actually looking at how things are going has a greater say over what's happening in the country. But it's a hugely important question. That's its own book.
Hi, Matthias Larkin, a postdoc here at Watson. You mentioned a whole bunch of problems in the resilience of global supply chains. I'm curious if you could say a bit more of why you think this is systematic and not a short-term phenomenon, and how this is material rather speculative. Because a brief question on each of these is that shipping costs indeed did go extremely high, but they fell right back down to prices pre-COVID. They went up again because of the Houthis. Now they're just about down to where they were before. So that seems rather short term to me. And the second one on the
Well, wait, I got to stop you there. They're not down to where they were before. I mean, they're still pretty close to where they were 2 months ago when we got the huge spike as the Houthis started using more sophisticated, in some cases, self-driving boats to go and explode vessels.
as far as I could see just now, it seemed like they're halfway down from their peak. But in any case, they're on their way down, and post-COVID they went right back down to where they were before. But the second one, on whether it's material or not, the most geopolitically sensitive trade should be between China and the U.S., right? And trade volumes there are still higher than they've ever been. So it doesn't seem like we're seeing it there. So I'm just asking if you could justify those a bit more.
Well, first, I mean, the question about shipping, we know that if we listen to earnings calls from executives at the shipping companies, they are celebrating every shock to the system. I mean, there is the suggestion out there that's entirely plausible that they're actually rooting for a strike by the ILA at these East and Gulf Coast ports, because they understand that whatever the increased unit costs are, they can pass them on and then some to the consumer because there isn't enough competition. So, I mean, we are effectively at the mercy of this hugely important industry that has massive barriers to entry. I mean, you and I cannot go start a shipping carrier because it takes years and billions of dollars just to amass the fleet. Moreover, the largest vessels that have the greatest economies of scale can only dock at a handful of ports. Those ports are, they operate terminals that are largely controlled directly by the shipping carriers themselves. I mean, that's a serious structural problem. I mean, I would think of it like this: like if United Airlines was responsible for plowing the tarmac at O'Hare Airport, and every time it snowed, they could say, "Hey, sorry, we don't have, got no space on your flight to LA, even though you have a confirmed ticket. But if you can pay 10 times as much, you can get out of here on the next flight." And that condition was allowable because there was this scarcity, because, there's a snowstorm that's limiting the slots. Ask yourself this, like, how much of an incentive would they have to really plow the runways? Because that's where we're at with this industry. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can listen to the earnings calls. I mean, you listen to Maersk, this giant Danish conglomerate that's in the largest alliance, and they're actively celebrating the record profits that will stem from this tremendous disruption that the rest of us are facing. Sorry, now you're asking about U.S., China, and the fact that trade volumes are enormous. Yeah, they are going up because China is suffering a real growth crisis. And there's an increasing subsidization of exports. And with domestic sales flagging, that product has to go somewhere. So it's effectively being dumped on world markets. And the shareholders of publicly traded companies who moved production to China initially because it was the ultimate way to lower their costs and reward their investors. By the way, I should pause to note, and I do this in the book, but I haven't done this here. I'm very critical of this notion that we should talk about China as it's this job-killing juggernaut. There aren't very many things that we agree on in this country now, but on both sides of the political aisle, we've decided that China's our enemy, and China is this great fundamental threat to American livelihoods. And as I detail in the book, in the same way in which Chinese workers were actively recruited by American rail companies to take the risk of building out the railroads as a way to undercut native-born and Irish-born laborers, we moved production to China for similar reasons. I mean, this was a way to get out from under unions and environmental and workplace safety regulations, and it was very prosperous for the companies that engaged in it. I mean, this is how the Walton family behind Walmart became the wealthiest family on earth, for a long time. So I don't want to come off as if I'm alleging some sort of Chinese conspiracy, but here's a place where supply and demand actually explains. You've got slower growth in China, and you've got a lot of product, and you've got a country that's dependent heavily on manufacturing jobs. So prices are going down, and companies, retailers around the world are availing themselves of those lower prices. At the same time, I mean, it may sound like a conflict, but it's really not. At the same time that companies like Walmart are actively looking to shift production to places like Mexico, places like India, I traveled with Columbia Sportswear as they looked to move production to Guatemala. So these things are all happening at the same time. Yes, sir.
Everyone gets the mic whether you like it.
Right. How you doing? Thank you for coming. My name is David. I'm a sociology PhD student. And my question is kind of centered around, it's a little bit more abstract. There was a part of your speech earlier where you talked about kind of us experiencing this destabilization is not part of it is positive because it allows us to like healthily reconfigure kind of like the reemergence of like a place-based way we're looking at our supply chains. I'm just curious in that description, are you imagining the kind of the benefits being translated to our labor force as well? And kind of like, I'm thinking when you say, this healthy reemergence, is this on account of workers? Do you believe like there could be direct implications for strengthening kind of workers' rights and like the abilities of laborers to kind of fortify kind of whether it be benefits, better wages, or are you just so imagining kind of like the redistribution of factory production to like the Western Hemisphere for America or kind of similar states? Like, I'm just wondering how this could affect overall patterns and productions of inequality in the labor force.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important question that is also its own book. But, I think it's kind of a jump ball, to be honest. I think on the one hand, what I was saying about trade with Mexico is significant, right? So if more production moves to Mexico, that does create opportunities for American manufacturers, and at a time when there's real labor mobilization, because one real positive of sustained lower unemployment, and the knowledge that driving a truck is real tough, and a lot of people doing it. It used to be pre-deregulation under Carter in the late 70s. A lot of people love to talk about Reagan, and Reagan's important, but a lot of this deregulation actually began in the Carter years. Well, prior to that, you had the Teamsters running the industry. It was always a tough job, right? You're on the road, you're away from your family, you're sitting behind the wheel of a truck, you're worrying about where to park, you want to caffeinate enough that you don't fall asleep at the wheel, but not so much you have to pull over, use the restroom all the time. But it used to pay a lot. And now people driving trucks who've often been actively recruited by these sophisticated ads that are touting, the open road, freedom. They've been sold on these predatory schemes where their training is paid for by their employers, but now they're effectively indentured to their employees for a couple of years. So the fact that there's labor mobilization because we ran out of truck drivers and we ran out of warehouse workers, that's to the positive. And more production concentrated closer to home should be an opportunity. That's part of the labor mobilization opportunity. But it's also true that automation is moving faster, and in large part because, going back to McKinsey talking about just-in-time and inventory, one of their great contributions, to this conversation is they convinced the corporate ranks that people should be treated like inventory, that people should be lean, that we should figure out how to have people be flexible, so like you're basically on call. You don't know if you're a parent, whether you can take care of your kid, whether you can take your kid to the doctor, whether you can do whatever it is you'd like to do for yourself at any given time, because you're not going to find out your schedule at the warehouse, until the next day, but you're only getting paid for the hours that you're in there. And so the response to labor mobilization, aiming at situations like that, improving them, has caused a lot of employers to look to bring in robots, right? Robots don't have kids who have to go to doctors. Robots don't go on strike. This is a big issue in this potential dock worker strike that we'll be hearing about more and more because it could happen as soon as Tuesday. So again, it's sort of a jump ball. There's definitely an opportunity. It's certainly a moment to talk about what incentives are at work in this economy. And I will say, by the way, I tell at some length in the book the story of Henry Ford, who is not someone we ought to lionize, racist, anti-Semite, crushed labor, but he knew something about supply chains and specifically making things at scale. And one of the things that he did that I think is worth keeping in mind, well, two stories I tell in the book. He refused to give dividends to the Dodge brothers as early investors, which brought a lawsuit from the Dodge brothers that they ultimately won. And I think you can kind of draw a straight line from that to modern day. He said, no, I'd rather use the money to expand my factory and boost my scale. He also doubled the wages of his workers in 1914. And some people in the business world at the time called him a communist. And he said, I just want to make my stuff at scale. And I understand that if I want my people showing up in their most creative frame of mind, they can't be worried about, who's putting groceries on the table at home. And he specifically said that any business that's premised on low wage labor is inherently unstable. And that is something that we really ought to reflect on, knowing that a lot of employers are going to be investing in robotics. Like that's where they'll go with that conversation. But the rest of us who, one thing I hope will come out of my book is like, you'll never see a package at your door in the same way again. We've been invited to not think about the people behind that, Amazon package that shows up at your door. Well, there are a lot of people there whose stories, it turns out, are pretty critical to, just selfishly, do we want this thing to be resilient or not? We got to have people able to make it in their own lives. So hopeful, but I wouldn't say confident, if that's an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi there. Thank you for coming. My name is Jimmy. I'm a master's student in data science. I was wanting to ask about more about India. You mentioned about your trip going to India, and I guess I'm not totally sure I fully understand exactly, what conclusions you sort of draw on whether or not, is like, did you end up finding, is India like a good place to sort of relocate factories to? And I guess for me, I'm thinking about like, India itself is like, it's not one of like the three like great powers in like the multipolar world. It's not the US, China, and Russia, but it's not necessarily like, I would argue it's not like uniquely in the camp exactly totally of, the US or China or Russia. It kind of, ping pongs plays the three great powers off each other in a way. So there's sort of like that sort of aspect of it where it's a little confusing as to why, we would want to relocate to India. The other thing as well is that compared to the other markets you mentioned, like Mexico or like Eastern Europe, like India isn't necessarily close geographically to any of the other large consumer markets. So I guess just the whole question about India, like I guess in general, I'm very confused about. So I was wondering.
Okay, fair enough. And I appreciate you asking the question. So look, after Trump takes office, he slaps across the board tariffs on Chinese imports. Biden continues that policy, even extends it in some cases. Then we get the pandemic, and people wake up to the reality that we're largely dependent upon Chinese factories for PPE, for basic materials for pharmaceuticals, for exercise bikes that we want to put in our basement because the gym's closed, but now we're waiting for them, for the workout gear we'd be wearing while we're on the Peloton that hasn't shown up, right? So there are all these reasons for companies to think about, how do we adjust to our excessive reliance on a single country? Never mind that it's a country that our country has decided to have a trade war with, like any country. We shouldn't be dependent on for that high a percentage of stuff like PPE, right? So that triggers some conversation around how do we bring strategic industries home to the US, like through the CHIPS Act, through the Inflation Reduction Act. We're talking about electric vehicles. We're talking about semiconductors. And then in things that aren't so strategic, like workout clothes, Columbia Sportswear starts thinking, where are we going to put this stuff where we're not going to be in this position again? Now, a lot of production initially moves to Vietnam, but then there's this new realization that a lot of the Vietnamese supply chain is dependent upon Chinese industry. So if we're worried about disruption in China, we don't get that much of a cushion from Vietnam. And then we look to individual hemispheres, right? So a lot of Southeast Asian factories will serve the Chinese market. The thinking goes over the longer term. Turkey, Eastern Europe will serve Western Europe. Latin America, the Caribbean can serve North America. Now, where does India fit in? you're quite correct. India doesn't deal with the shipping problem, right? Because wherever you are on the globe, there's a good chance you're going to have to move stuff a long way. What India presents, and the reason why India is an interesting example is, first of all, it's the world's most populous country. And it's got a young population, and it's got very high skills in terms of engineering. It's increasingly got an active startup scene. Narendra Modi, who is, for very good reason, extremely controversial, another figure we shouldn't be lionizing, has nonetheless invested in trying to catch up with other more sophisticated economies in terms of infrastructure. So there's a huge port build out. There's a big highway build out, which is why I was in the back of that truck. And India, at least on paper, has the raw materials that if we're talking about waiting decades, could potentially get out from under dependence upon the Chinese supply chain. Today, India is very dependent upon the Chinese supply chain, especially pharma, electronics as well. But if you're looking for a place in the world, now personally, I push back on this idea that like anybody's going to replace China. What will replace China is a more rational spreading of production around the globe. But if your model is, I want to get out from under dependence upon China, I need a place with lots of people, young people, that's building the infrastructure and that won't just have to import all the stuff from China to make the stuff I need, India checks a lot of boxes. And that's why investment's looking there. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I wanted to ask you this question. How many jobs are lost in the United States annually due to automation?
I do not know that offhand. I will tell you that I am skeptical of the idea that automation is just intrinsically a job killer. I think it's used as a way to tip the balance in collective bargaining. And by the way, I mean, I'm dubious, and I push back in the book, of the idea that trade, is intrinsically a job killer. I mean, I think a lot of the attention that we're properly spending on the so-called China shock, where, in the decade or so after China enters the World Trade Organization, we lose 1 million direct manufacturing jobs and 2 million if you include, the truck drivers who are no longer delivering to factories that don't exist anymore. This is, based on work by people like David Otter at MIT. I argue in the book that this is really an inside job, right? These job losses are a function of the fact that we abandon our own people. We have trade adjustment assistance, which is supposed to help transition workers to new careers. There are very effective job training schemes in places like the Nordic countries. But here, we have much lower taxes. We don't tax wealthy people. We don't have effective programs. We don't have national health care. We don't help communities where housing is suddenly underwater en masse because everybody lost their job at once. And so even if, the trade experts will say, well, just move to Arizona and become a solar installer if you lost your job making, refrigerators in Newton, Iowa. Well, it's not so easy if your house is underwater, if you got kids in school, if nobody's helping you make that transition. And we've done such a poor job of that, which verges into my last book, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World, that, it's been easy for political opportunists to then tell a story that's like, it's China, the job-killing juggernaut, it's Mexico, and it's immigrants who are stealing people's, all these sort of simplistic explanations of crises that are very real. So, you've asked a simple question. I've given you a complicated answer. How many jobs are lost? Some jobs are lost to automation, but some jobs are created by automation, right? The question is, who's in control of the automation and what are the incentives that are deploying it? And in a moment where shareholder interests are paramount and where unions, while they're on the march, have been historically weak, automation is basically deployed, like at the ports now, as a way to make workers feel insecure, to undercut their bargaining position in collective bargaining. It's not that we should look at automation as somehow evil. I mean, it's the natural human inclination, right, to take physically demanding, dangerous jobs and make them easier. I'm not a Luddite. Like, we should embrace automation, we should embrace innovation, but we got to think about the people who are affected. And there are effective ways to help people make transitions that we haven't handled.
What about gendered jobs? For instance, in the telephone industry, those jobs that women would have where they could pretty much live a middle-class life have now lost because of automation.
I'm sorry.
Times past, the woman that was a telephone operator, she was, now it's all automated.
Sure, but look, the classic example of this, right, is people said, oh, banks will lose jobs when we put in ATMs, right, because you don't need as many people acting as tellers. In fact, we had a huge boom in jobs in banking, way too much, if you ask me, because we then optimized our economy for finance, which is a subject that Professor Blythe knows more about than probably anybody in the room. But the idea that ATMs would be job killers just wasn't borne out. You then freed up labor for other services that pop up. I mean, people are going to innovate. It's really a question of, are there cushions for people? Are there ways to help people make transitions? And in this country, because we have no national health care, because our social safety net has been depleted so much, to finance tax cuts for the billionaire class, it's a long way down. And in places like the Nordic countries where there's much more of a tradition of, well, we pay higher taxes, we have greater social services, it's maybe perversely and counterintuitively much easier for people to make transitions. It's easier for people to say, oh, maybe I'll launch a startup now because I lost my job. Actually, I'll tell you, I went to a mine in Sweden back in 2017 where they were testing out self-driving cars. And I talked to the people working there. And as an American, I assumed that they would be aghast at this. And they all said, no, we're fine with it, actually, because, this will make our company more competitive. And if our company's more competitive, it'll be more profitable and our wages will go up. And this wasn't some sort of utopian fantasy. This was a function of the fact that in Sweden, the Employers Association meets with the national union and they hash out wages that have really quite reliably passed on productivity gains to working people in the form of wages, which is not what's happened in this country, right? We've seen this enormous divergence from the late 70s where productivity keeps going up, but wages stagnate and even go down in many industries. And so as a result, those guys were more willing to take the risks of this new technology. We love to think of ourselves in this country as like, this is the country of Schumpeter and creative destruction, and we're swashbuckling capitalists, unlike those, nanny state loving Europeans. It's really quite the opposite. I mean, if you don't have a social safety net, then especially if you are still in a union, you're quite rationally opposed to any change. Those dock workers who are opposing automation in this strike that may happen next week are not wrong to have looked around and said, man, if I lose a job, it could be really bad. I could have a hard time getting a job that even pays half of what I used to be making. Nobody's giving me health care. I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent or my mortgage or whatever. And if we had some of those things taken care of, they might be more likely to say, you know what, maybe I don't feel like worrying about getting crushed by a container anymore. Maybe I will go work in an EV battery plant, or maybe I'll just start some business in my community that but we actually are very limited in the risks we can take because we do so little for people who are making those transitions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? One last, there we go, right here. Got two.
Thank you. I appreciate your talk and your response to the questions.
Thank you.
I guess I have two questions. So I was intrigued by the comment you made earlier about how sort of crisis is kind of endogenous to this larger structure, because it seems companies sometimes can benefit from crises and disruptions. So I was wondering why we haven't experienced as much until COVID. Maybe COVID is happening at such a scale that we can have a shipping price going from 2,000 to 20,000. But why companies weren't doing that before COVID, or maybe they were, but on a smaller scale. And second question is, so you talk about how incredibly complex the supply chain has become, right? So, but I think if we think about the like the CHIPS Act, it's very focused on one, step of the process, but nobody really asks about, oh, what happened to, the packaging of the chips, or, where the chips are assembled into the eventual products. But if we want to think about, you're bringing such a, complex supply chain to, close to the United States, how feasible do you think that would look like?
Well, I'll take your second question first. I think it's feasible to bring supply chains back to the United States in areas where there are subsidies. And like those significant strategic areas like semiconductors and EVs. But, there have been a lot of stumbles, right, in the story of semiconductors coming back to the U.S. I mean, we've seen TSMC in Arizona is moving much more slowly than they thought. Part of this is the housing crisis. It's hard for them to find places for people to live in Arizona. The costs are high. Regulations are different than they're used to. Intel seems to be moving more slowly than we thought. So there is a lot of complexity to this, but it will happen, right? I mean, if the government is divvying up, tens of billions of dollars to subsidize these industries, somebody's going to take the money, and the investment will eventually happen. In terms of other industries, it's much more difficult to imagine. I mean, there's a branding thing that's happening in terms of made in the U.S. as consumers seem to be much more sensitive to the question of where their things are made, and what human rights issues might go into the production of products from across the ocean. And there's greater sensitivity there, but price still overwhelmingly matters. And let's face it, there are alternatives to so-called reshoring, right? I mean, this is why Mexico, Central America are getting a long look for us. And sorry, I lost track of your first question.
So why we didn't see more crisis before COVID? Because I think you were suggesting that companies often benefit from this crisis, so they kind of.
Oh, okay, yeah, right. Well, shipping is a very complex story, right? So shipping has for a long time been effectively subsidized by national governments in places like mainland China, Taiwan, Korea, as a way to boost exports. I mean, it's been part of industrial strategy, right? So a lot of credit from governments for shipbuilding, for the construction of ports, and the carriers weren't emphasizing, making any money. And that has changed. That was already changing, for a decade before the pandemic, but there was such a glut that it was hard for any of them to make money. And the pandemic gave them a template that they seem to be following, ever since, because there was no reason for shipping prices to spike to the extent that they did early this year when the Houthis were opening fire on and effectively closing off the Suez Canal. I mean, we know that the prices went up, well in excess of the underlying cost, but they had gotten the pandemic as a template. In other industries, we have seen crises turn into pricing power. It's just that it's often so subtle, I mean, the beef story, which I tell in the book, where ranchers are going out of business at the same time that consumers are paying record high prices for beef. That's a story that's decades in the making, right? That's the essentially evisceration of antitrust enforcement in the U.S. that goes back to Reagan and continues, ever since, where we now have 4 companies that control 85% of the slaughterhouse capacity in the United States, and they have very systematically, looked for opportunities to cut capacity, to concentrate their capacity in bigger plants so that the ranchers have fewer places to sell to, so they're dependent upon these single plants. And the pandemic was really just the reveal of trends that had been there for decades. But this stuff's complicated, right? And every industry is different.
Just a comment on another couple of examples. Anybody who's flown an airline in the United States, there are 4 carriers. They control over 60% of the market, 70% by some measures. If you include alliances, it's 80%. Go on a website and try and find a different price. And what's happened to the quality of the service? Like, you can now literally buy the middle seat at, that becomes your default. If you go on American Airlines now, they have 4 different qualities of main cabin. It's nickeling and diming the thing to death, right? And the other one, the most obvious one, is finance. And in 2008, too big to fail was a business model. So once you admit that, once you basically know that if I lever up 50 to 1, you'll never let me fail, you'll bail me out and then I'll do it again. And I'll continue to do it. And that's not my business model, is basically extortion of the taxpayer. So, far from having not seen it before, as Peter says, this is just a moment of obvious reveal. It's been around for the past 30 years.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
One last one. You'll
Thanks so
need to get, where is it? Fetch the instrument of power.
Thanks so much for the talk.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
So I was just wondering about your thoughts on how does China's industrial overcapacity play in your story? So China is only doubling down on perpetuating this overcapacity, and it arguably is in the very core ideology of the Chinese state.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much a concerted strategy to double down on overcapacity as much as growth is flagging at home. You've got the overhang of so many failed real estate ventures. You've got worries about debt levels that have never been there, in the post-reform era. You've got, Belt and Road being, pulled back tremendously because of worries about limited capital, and consumers are tight with their money. Part of that is a reflection of the failure of the Chinese state to build out things like a national healthcare system or a greater retirement system, which would give people the confidence to spend more money. And so China is a country of savers, and if people are saving and economic growth is flagging, and you're worried about debt, well, you're now looking at surplus product, and you're either going to liquidate people's jobs and turn it off, or you're going to continue and have to figure out how to sell it. And so de facto, that becomes, dump that stuff on global markets. It's not that, I'm not partial to the story that, the central government has decided that this is somehow productive economic policy, because they certainly understand that increases their problems in terms of trade frictions, not just with the United States, with much of Europe, with Asian trading partners as well. I think they're in this bind where they need to protect jobs because, let's face it. Since the reform era, the claim that the Chinese Communist Party has to legitimacy is rising living standards and nationalism. And for the first time, we've got a generation of young people in China seriously worried about high unemployment, and they're likely not going to do as well as their parents, and that's really a problem. So all of that it gets expressed as dumping stuff on world markets, but that's just an outgrowth of a bunch of other policy failures.
But also the other fact is that they're maybe less of trying to just dumping things into the world market than trying to develop technology and in terms of that kind of more high-end production as their surviving strategy when they're having a lot of this sense of crisis with the siege of the West and the things going on internally. So that this is kind of what I'm talking about is they're going to be, the world market is going to be full of the biopharmaceutical equipment or ingredients from China. Well, that's just part of it. So because I'm more familiar with that domain, but there's certainly on other domains that will be full of the things coming out of China. So if that were the case, which I tend to believe that would be the case, does that certainly how would you evaluate that the consequence on the in terms of you want to reshape the structure of the global supply chain? Is it going to just get worse, or?
I think it's going to depend a lot on national policies around the globe. Certainly, if the result of domestic tensions inside China, if that turns into just a sustained export boom at lower and lower prices, that's going to be a problem because we know if Trump wins, he's talking about 60% across the board tariffs. If Harris wins, I mean, we know much less about her in terms of trade policy. We know that she's one of 10 senators who actually voted against the reworked NAFTA. And she said nothing to indicate a break with Biden on U.S.-China policy. So the trade war continues. We know that on the one hand, I mean, Europe is a more complicated situation because, lately we've seen major auto producers like Germany and Spain now lobbying against the tariffs on Chinese EVs because they're really concerned about an evolving trade war with China because they're actually exporting a lot of parts to China as part of the Chinese supply chain, and they'd like to be able to sell more finished cars as well. So there's sort of a split in Europe that doesn't exist in the U.S., but certainly more cheap exports. That's going to ratchet up tensions, and then it will depend upon how individual nations react in terms of where we go forward. Hey, thank you guys very much. This was a great back and forth. I really enjoyed it.